But hi everyone in the room and at home. Hello there. My name is Michelle Whitty. I'm the Nature Education Director from Wildfire Nature Center, your host for this afternoon's Climate Action Sunday. We're super lucky to have Boulder Watershed Collective as well as Julian from CU. I'll have to get a little more of the dots connected here from both, right? Yeah. They're talking about forest health and a collaboration project they did in Gold Hill. And we're going to dive into all of that with all of them introduce themselves. They have quite the crew today, and I'm super excited to learn from them. Those of you in the room and at home, feel free to ask questions during, but we'll also have a big chunk of time for questions at the end. Just another reminder for anyone at home, I can see your messages, but I cannot see your beautiful faces. So please communicate through the chat box, and I'll be moderating that. That way all of our presenters can get your comments and your questions and anything else you might have to share. Great, awesome. Let's go ahead and get started.
Try and focus on the in-person and the computer at the same time.
You got it.
So I'm Maya. I'm the director of the Boulder Watershed Collective, and excited to have almost all of our staff today. There's 4 of us here to talk with you all, and we've also had this partnership going. This will be upcoming our 3rd year with the Masters of the Environment program at CU. So we work with a group of students each year who do their capstone project with us. So it's a year-long project where we really kind of do some concentrated focus on a certain thing. And we're really lucky to have worked with Julian this last year, who has been amazing, and we've gotten some amazing work done. Still, which we've kind of used as a pilot project to help us develop our forest health and community collaboration. So we're going to tell you a little bit about that today. But I wanted to just give you a little bit of background about the Boulder Watershed Collective. We are really hoping to create a resilient watershed, a resilient Boulder Creek watershed. We primarily focus on the Boulder Creek watershed. And we really feel like that is a combination of creating resilient social and ecological systems. So really focusing on the ecosystems that we live in, but also really working with the communities to make sure that we can steward our ecosystems well. And so we started after the 2013 flood event. We focused just in 4 Mile Canyon because they had had a fire in 2010, and so there was really a lot of damage from the flood in 2013. And so we really were focused on stream restoration for a long time, but once flood recovery kind of started to wane, which took many years, like 6 years it felt like, we really started to expand our programs and think about how we could be, have a more holistic approach to watershed health. And so these are our primary focus areas. We do watershed restoration. We also do climate adaptation and resilience. That's one of our focuses, and we do a lot of community engagement. And really each of these programmatic areas, are a big intersection with each other, and there's a lot. Next. Yeah, so this is just a little bit about what we do. We obviously have done a ton of stream restoration, but in 4 Mile Canyon, because there was a lot of mining, we were unable to do some of the stream restoration without also focusing on mining. And so we kind of accidentally got into mine reclamation, which turned out to be a really amazing process. And these mine waste piles, which look like cut right through, are now gone, and we have a better, more healthy riparian area. We also do a lot of water quality sampling and have done some of that up in the Netherlands and the Caribou area. We do really expanding our education programming for kids, our forest health, and our wildfire risk reduction program. So that's mainly what we're going to focus on today. And so we are taking to kind of match our vision. We're really taking an approach to forest health, which is really working intensively with communities to better understand their values and their priorities. And then once we have that understanding, we can move forward together with the community, to facilitate these conversations and co-develop projects together that really address the priorities of that community. And so we're really, as a nonprofit organization, we're trying to find the gaps in agencies and communities so that we can help fill those gaps and
a lot of times that is in seeking funding and doing more of the administration pieces like grants and project management, stuff like that. So I'm going to hand it over to Erin now, right? Or Julian, never mind. It's going to be Julian.
Yeah. Sit down, actually. I'm over here. That works. And yeah, you can do the next slide. So was part of the Menv team working with Boulder Watershed Collective, which does this capstone process, which is kind of like a mix of consulting, internship. And so we were really working with Boulder Watershed Collective on community resilience as it relates to wildfire. You can go to the next slide here. I was also working with Brian and Corey, who are my other teammates, but they couldn't make it today. And so we were really trying to focus on this question, how do we create sort of climate adapted communities, and how do we create resilience to wildfire specifically? And to simplify as much as possible and to really cut out all of the complexity, it kind of boils down to these two things: coordinating land management across a wide range of land that includes public and private ownership, and getting these to work with sort of a shared goal, shared vision in mind for land management, and then also a collective action from community members to build more resistant communities, addressing fuel in the home ignition zone, home hardening, and really working on community resilience in evacuation and communications and things like that. So this is kind of what we were really focusing on with our project. Here, you can go to the next slide. And so for the land management piece of this, I mean, Maya really has this down to an art. She's very good at coordinating with people and getting landowners to really talk and think about how to manage their land with wildfire in mind. And so we were kind of working more on sort of a broader idea of how do we get people to coordinate land management across different ranges of private ownership and public lands. And we really hit on this idea of the commons as one way to really think about managing land across different ownership ranges. And so the commons is just an area of land that everyone sort of holds in common. And we find that around here, a lot of people actually see the forests as this communal space, as this commons, where they build their identity, where they go and recreate and use, and they really want to, that it means something to them when the land changes. And so you can't just go and do land management without involving the community because they feel like something is changing their identity. And so we're really trying to use this sort of management model as a way to bring landowners together to sort of create more of a shared vision for how to address fire across landscapes. And so some of the main principles of the commons that we're really trying to bring in are, really bringing a voice to community members. This is a lot of our community engagement effort to make sure that people have a say when things change on the land that they, know and love. And this kind of shows up in a really wonderful way in Gold Hill. That piece of land that you see here holds what's called the North Trail. And this is owned by one person, Caroline Ashley, but everyone in the town sort of uses this space, uses the trail, and it's one of their favorite things about Gold Hill is this access to this trail. And it acts as a commons in the sense that people are protecting the privacy. In Gold Hill, you're kind of, it's kind of frowned upon to tell outsiders about the trail and to encourage use from outsiders. And so they work together in this way to sort of prevent it from becoming overused. And so interesting ways that while this is private land, it really becomes kind of this communal process of managing and engaging with that land. So that's sort of how we're thinking about sort of the larger aspects. And we can go to the next slide here, which really brings us into the next piece, which is how do we build community resilience and how do we tie the land management to the community resilience piece. And this is sort of a process or a visual that we came to after all of our work. We kind of, worked it through as we went. But really creating this model is really focusing on how do we bring the community into the conversation? How do we get people to sort of take responsibility and take action for their resilience? And so this is kind of linear. You can do things in different ways, but we're going to talk a little bit about getting to know the community better. One of the things that, or we did a number of things to really address this piece here. We did a survey, but of course, Scoldtail, I'm sure people in Netherlands also feel similarly. Everyone has survey fatigue. No one really wants to take surveys. But the way we did our survey dissemination is we went around and we knocked on everyone's door. And so this sort of really changed our experience of passing out the survey. We had a lot of really personal interactions with people, which then led us to realizing that we really needed to move into interviews and more community, a visioning process that brought people together to really talk, because people were really interested in talking about wildfire, but less so in answering surveys. So this was sort of our getting to know the community, is surveying, talking to community leaders, really interviewing people and bringing them together for conversations. Yeah, I think we can move on to the next slide here. So some of the results that came from our survey and interviews, I'm going to try and run through this sort of briefly, but somewhat obviously, people in small towns have really strong connections with each other, and this really helps them in getting things done and in doing projects at a community level. One of the narratives out there is that people aren't doing wildfire work on their homes, and we found that this is maybe a little overblown, that in fact people are often doing work to harden their homes against wildfire and are even helping each other become resilient to wildfire. There are networks in place for people to get go bags if an evacuation happens and someone's not there, and there are people who help other people harden their house. So there are these informal networks and people are actually doing the work. And so we're really trying to, we hope that we can sort of change this narrative that no one is doing wildfire work and sort of move it to a more productive version, which is people are doing some, they're doing what they can. And there are also people willing to help do more. And we need to sort of act together to do more. And so we can move on to the next one here. Followed by, what are some of the major challenges that people have working on their homes? What's really interesting about this graph is the difference between what people thought other people's challenges were versus what their own challenges were. If you see the red lines, people thought other people's challenges were cost, physical difficulty, and it would require too much time. But for their own challenges, they said that their adjacent property is not mitigated. So they're less likely to take an action because they think their neighbors aren't taking actions, which really feeds into that narrative that we were talked about in the first trend, really being able to shift the idea that no one is doing this work so that we can begin to productively talk about how do we do this together and how do we do more work together. But yeah, and there we go. Yeah, so and generally these are the main things. And so we also have to focus on how do we make wildfire mitigation like as simple as possible for people, because it's not something that everyone thinks about every day of their lives. I mean, it's a really important part of living in the mountains, but it's not something you're going to become obsessed with or do every day. So how do we really make the process of becoming resilient as easy as possible? And I think one of the ways we can do this is trying as an organization is to try our best to reduce cost, to provide labor and find innovative ways to help manage these barriers, help people overcome the time and the actual difficulty of doing the work. We can go to the next slide here. Third, one of the things that affects support for land management is often past experience with land managers. We heard a number of stories of people who maybe had no idea that a project was coming, and then they drove by an area of the forest one day and saw the trees gone and felt rather violated because they see this as part of their land, as part of their commons. This can be a really traumatizing event and change the way people view forest management work. And so one of the things as an organization we can learn from this is really being as transparent as possible, and bringing people into the work as much as we can, so that we don't have that, oh, you just came and did something to my land, to this place that I see as mine, without, and I had no say and no agency in this. I can go to the next slide. And finally, that actually people's perceptions and beliefs do change when they learn new information. However, pamphlets are not going to get people to change their mind or support forest restoration or make behavior change. A lot of this has to do with really being interactive, allowing people to bring their questions and concerns to events so that you can address worries and barriers in person. So making sure that your education is very tactile and interactive, and it will have an effect. So this was one of the interesting things, because we know that a lot of environmental change, a lot of environmental behavior change doesn't work with just knowledge. So this is interesting to know that it can, if we're more interactive and we actually listen and participate in this process. And I think move on. And then I just wanted to move into a little bit of the visioning event that we did with the town of Gold Hill, because this was rather generative and we came up with some really wonderful ideas for how the community can make themselves more resilient. And many of these changes fell into these three categories here. Basically shifting our perceptions. What do we see is a healthy forest? A lot of people love dense forests for their shade and privacy, but how do we begin to shift that, living out here on the Front Range, where wildfire should be a normal part of the ecology? How do we shift our understanding of what a healthy forest is in order to appreciate the beauty of maybe less dense forests that are more ecologically able to receive fire? Next is community organization, really getting communities to break down those barriers for people, having more organizations, so like field days or work days or programs that help people work on their houses. So really building these aspects into the way the community functions. One of the great ideas was a community woodshed, so that people wouldn't have to keep their wood outside their house, but could be kept in this fireproof safe, and then everyone could go and get wood on their own. And then also individual preparedness, which we talked about in the community organization, but community organization also covers evacuation and how do we link and network with each other, whereas individual preparedness is really making sure that the homes themselves and the people are prepared and hardened, and people work on the home ignition zone for wildfire. I think we can move on to the next slide. Oh yeah, this just goes into more of that, more of these more concrete ideas. So creating tiered goals and annual assessments, having goals for the community to accomplish, something like a CWPP, areas of the forest that we want to tackle first, all the way down to neighborhood level. We want neighbors to be connected and to work on homes in this area. And how do you then assess that to make sure you're making progress year by year, so that you have this forward momentum towards resilience? Micro neighborhoods was one of the ways people talked about linking people together, linking neighbors together, really trying to focus on fire resilience in just this small block. And then everyone else can read here. I don't have to go through every single one. Resource hub, acquiring more funding, which with new state funding opportunities, this is becoming easier this year. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to let my colleagues sort of complexify everything that I tried to simplify.
Okay, yes, well, thanks everyone for being here. And also letting my little one be here too. I'm due in May, so I'm very excited. I know. Just so if you were wondering, is she pregnant? Yes, she is. So I wanted to give just a little bit of transitioning from, okay, what we did in Gold Hill specifically, but how do we think about values from a social science perspective? I won't take too long, but just how complex it can be to study those values. And we will be working with another group in Netherlands, another Masters in the Environment group this summer. And so this is kind of giving a little perspective on how do we go from something very specific to Gold Hill to understanding the general complexities that we understand from the literature and from past experience. Yes. Good. So I can also do it, Michelle, too. It's easier. Okay. And let me know if you can't hear me. So we have some really cool theories. This value, beliefs, norm theory is very foundational to social science. Right now, it's still being used. It was formed in this environmental movement time in the late 90s. And they wanted to understand, how do we get from a person's values to changing behavior? Not just how do we influence behavior change, but how do we tap into something a little bit deeper and something that's more true to who that person is. And so they studied behavior change around changes to environmental consumerism, changes to how they support policy, and how they have individual behavior changes, like how much water you use. And so what they saw really strongly was there's not this direct link between values and behavior change. It's actually through other factors. So I'm going to guide you through those factors. So first is the values themselves. You have to have the environmental value. Okay, I think this is a worthwhile cause or worthwhile ecosystem. And then you have to have the belief. The next slide, I can do this. Oh, thanks, Lynn. The belief, I know, this is why you shouldn't have animations. The belief that ecosystem or environmental cause is threatened. I have to understand that that is something that I think is needing some sort of change around it. Okay, and then the next factor is the idea that I'm going to say that I can be responsible. The things I do can actually change and influence that ecosystem or environmental movement, and that I ascribe my own actions as responsible, at least partly, for hindering or helping supporting those ecosystems. The next factor, and this again, a really complex theory, is that changes my personal norms through a lot of time, through small incremental changes in my life. I can start to norm that behavior and say, okay, this is more individually where I'm going to shift my actions and perspective. So it becomes part of my daily life. And norms also relate to social norms. We see it kind of slowly catching on in the communities that we live. And then lastly, then they found that link to behavior change itself. So it's like this really crazy connection to behavior change from our own personal values. And the strength of this relationship is how efficacious I feel. If I feel like I have a really low status in my community, or if I don't feel like I can actually make change, then this link is really not strong, but it can be really strong if I feel like I can actually do this, I can make change. So it's a great theory and helps kind of break down some of the complexities of why we want to study values and why it's important to think about other parts of who a person is that link to values. So next slide, then I'm going to talk about the social ecological template. So not only are values important, but we also know that we can have a strong impact on decision making. And we see this, this is a template where they tried to combine social factors like generational factors, population change, historical factors, or things that people, dynamics in a community, how that's linked to ecology and ecosystem change, and then how that actually feedbacks and changes how we manage land, how we think about our relationships with land. So the first thing, and when we think about living with fire, how our relationship with fire, really in the 1900s, and we can go to the next one, is we have a lot of fire suppression. So this changed our relationship with fire from one where it exists as an element, as part of the land, to one of fear. I think the origins of this, I think, are from what I've read, partly that you created the first urban interfaces, wildland urban interfaces, by having more people moving into these areas. But there also is some evidence that like the movies like Bambi really influenced people's perception of wildfire as a fear. I don't know how strong that was, but just know in the 1900s, you changed our relationship with wildfire. So then this actually consequently changed how we suppressed fire, which then changed ecosystems themselves, especially these lower elevation ponderosa pine that have mixed severity fires historically. With this fire suppression, we had high, density growth, and then it has high competition between these different trees, but then you have a lot of fuel load and interacting with climate change. What you get is actually this really high, and you can go next slide, high intensity wildfires that have much more high tree mortality rates. So what we perceive is changing how we do this, and now the last especially 20 years in Boulder County area, we've seen really intense, and Denver area has seen intense wildfires, and even from the 80s. And so then when we have exposure like this, that then changes how we do prescribed fire. And we actually are less likely to do prescribed fire now with this fear, and we're likely to continue to suppress it, and less likely to see the ecological benefits that are reaped from wildfire, which then actually feeds into us being more afraid of fire. So it's this like very interesting cyclical loop here. This story is changing. We know that people are more likely nowadays to actually start thinking about wildfire as part of the landscape and a healthy piece. But because we've been in this cycle, it's really complex how we get out of it. So it's not just about community values, but it's how we've been in a pattern already. How do we get out of that? So the next slide, which I think you're a few ahead, Lynn, this one, so their values are really hard to study. We know that. They're hard to define, first off. So this study, they actually asked people to physically map these different ecosystem services. Like, where do you think biological diversity is? And this was in the Pike St. Isabel forests in Colorado. They were like, okay, we have $1,000. How much are you going to put towards biological diversity? And where along this map are you going to put that money? So they asked people to map these things. Well, I don't know about you, but a lot of these things interact with each other for me. I know that spiritual and recreational and intrinsic values are all things that I think about as a value of my forests, but it'd be really hard to separate them. So first off, it's hard to define, it's hard to separate. These are really complex things. It also depends on the frame. If someone asks me, what do you value in terms of forest management versus what do you value in terms of saving the Preble's jumping mouse, they're going to be different. I'm going to have different frames of reference. So it's a complex thing that they're asking people to do. What they found when people actually mapped these values in the next slide is pretty interesting. So they compared this to biophysical models. Ecologists come up with a model. They compare that to where people mapped their social values. And what they found was everything in red or blue is congruent. Everything in blue is saying, okay, low value, low biophysical model, like low ecosystem services, like carbon sequestration or biological diversity. And then everything in red are areas where it's both high. I have a high social value and it actually is providing lots of ecosystem services. The yellow and green are places where they did not match up, meaning that in some instances, there was actually really high ecosystem service, but the community and individual was ranked at low. And those were likely to be at places where there was an ecotone or an ecosystem shift, like where the tree line happens. People saw, oh, that's not very high biodiversity, but those actually were high biological diversity areas. And so there's these discrepancies between what the public perceives and what's actually there. And so it's interesting to bring and think about that we need social license. We know social license influences management decisions, but we can't have just one or the other. We can't just have ecological models and we can't just have community perceptions. It's really important to pull those together for a much more nuanced picture of management. So, and then the next slide, the other thing about values is that they're really dynamic. They change through time, and they can contradict each other. And so as we think about how things change through time, we can think about climate change. Like, people highly value the Great Barrier Reef right now. They're going to be using it to death. And therefore, it might be that actually creates more damage to that ecosystem, which then brings down the value later on. So values change through time, but it also, Sarah McCaffrey, who's a forester, U.S. Forest Service, she does a lot of social science research. She looked and saw that people have a finite pool of worries at any point. And so at any point, you have these pool of worries that you can kind of prioritize, and that sometimes they contradict each other. Like if I wanted to have really sustainable, landscaping, I'd want like more pollinator species, and I'd want to make sure that I have a lot of vegetation. Whereas wildfire mitigation, you might want to kind of reduce some of the mitigation or the kind of vegetation around your home, depending. So you have these points where they contradict each other, and you have to weigh in the pros and cons of your own values. So it's very tricky it's a complex system here. And I say this just to set you up for how much more complicated forest management can be with these complications of community values in mind. So, and with that, I'll introduce Nate.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you, Aaron. To give a little background, so my name is Nathaniel Geckner. I work with Aaron and Maya and Julian as well with the Boulder Watershed Collective, and I am our forest program manager. And so we can kind of dive right into it. And I'll let you know, like right now, we're going to be talking about forest ecology and management kind of on a broader scale. So think maybe 6,000 feet elevation up to like 10,000. And we can get into a little bit more specifics about Netherland kind of in the Q&A, and we'll have some things that are directly tied to that as well. Thank you. Yeah, so as Julian, Aaron, and Maya, everyone kind of really touched on this, and being in the mountain community, I'm sure everyone here kind of knows what the problem is, right? This isn't kind of a new thing for anyone who's been reading the news lately, but so really the problem is, fire suppression over the past 100 years and land use practices have really altered our historic forest structures, compositions, and especially those fire regimes, right? Aaron had touched on it really well that, fire was a element on the landscape, right? Like the Western landscape is flammable, and fire has played a role in that for thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. And all of a sudden we kind of lost that presence. So what we're also seeing now though, is a lot of these fires are starting to expand into the WUI, the urban wildland urban interface, which I'm sure a lot of people in Netherland know about, as well as Boulder, and I think a lot of the audience that we have here at Wildfire. And so what's kind of being exacerbated by this, and that's that bottom point there, is, we're learning how to, adaptively manage this in the face of climate change. It's something that we really haven't seen historically at this rate. And, this is something that is kind of, you might have now kind of brought your eyes upon it with, the Marshall Fire and just that past 2022 or 2020 fire season. Ever since the Hayman Fire in 2003, every single fire year since that has been a larger fire successively, right? So each year, we're breaking that record, and that kind of shows, and we'll go into some of this in these upcoming slides. So this is kind of what we're talking about. These two graphs here is a really good visualization of what we mean with that, that forest structure being altered. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a fire suppressed forest, right? So I like to think of, these big trees, these are ponderosa, we have some lodgepoles here. But if you look on that left-hand side, up at the very top left-hand corner, there's a lot of smaller things in there. And, some of that is, we're getting shade-tolerant Douglas fir, we're getting smaller lodgepole pine, just trees that typically wouldn't have been there because they would have been cleaned out. There would have been a haircut on that forest with a low to mixed severity fire kind of coming through and cleaning a lot of that area. And so as you can see here, we see that, this leads to fire kind of getting up into the crowns of trees and really increasing that severity. And, I want to say one thing, like, fire severity shouldn't be kind of grouped in the same thing. What you typically saw with these fires was a mixed severity approach, right? Not all fires are going to act the exact same way in different forest areas. And there's some other things that we'll go into. So I just want to keep that in your head to not kind of group fire as all destructive and, kind of destroying the landscape. But this is just some things that we're seeing in some areas. But really the thing that's kind of, shocking with this, and that's that bottom left-hand corner, is with some of these areas now with climate change, and we'll be going into that in the next slide, but we're seeing a real decrease in tree regeneration and an increase in tree mortality. So a lot of these forests are having a hard time bouncing back, and it's harder for that younger cohort of trees to really kind of reoccupy that spot. And the Hayman fire is actually a really great example for this. There's a lot of research going on now where, you know, they're really not seeing that forest grow back. It's probably going to look a little similar to a grassland, to a shrubland, because of some of the things that we're seeing now. But yeah, so kind of the reverse to that, what we're really striving for, right, on the landscape, is something on this right-hand side, something that looks a lot more like this. And that's that ecologically managed forest. And there are a lot of things that can ecologically manage a forest, right? And we'll be going into those in further slides as well. But I want to just keep this in your head. You know, look at the densities here, kind of the mix. You know, it's not so crowded. There's some spacings, and different forests will act, you know, kind of differently, and we'll go into some of those species. But generally, this is kind of what we're seeing with those trends with the fuel buildup in our forests. So yeah, kind of right here, right? Wildfires and climate. So to kind of give you a background, fire is really kind of tied into weather, and weather can be altered by a changing climate. And so, you know, temperature, wind, moisture, all of this is a pretty vicious feedback with a lot of wildfire. And that's something that directly can impact fire behavior. But so, you know, in the West, we're seeing increasing temperatures, right? We're seeing a snowpack that is melting earlier into the spring, longer fire seasons, and larger fires. And along with all of that, we've been seeing a tripling of homes burned and a lot more large, frequent evacuations. And anyone who's been on the Front Range probably since, you know, 2019 has definitely recognized that with our 2020 fire season, as well as this last Marshall fire. But so this third fact here is something that kind of catches my eye a lot, you know, and this is just in the state of Colorado, right? Our mean yearly temperature has increased by about an average of 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So, you know, that might not sound like a lot, but that's happened in just the last 30 years. And with climate change, what we're talking about is we're talking about a J curve. So that's exponential growth. So think it's more than just like doubling. Like there's a vicious steepness of that curve. So, you know, 2 degrees every 30 years might change to 4. And if you're thinking about this as well, is that's 2 degrees across hundreds of thousands of square acres of forest. And so you can't really like downplay how significant that is. And the thing here is, you know, our climate is changing faster really than a lot of these ecological processes can adapt to it. And this is kind of what we're seeing with, it's going to change probably how we look at our forests and what our forests look like into the future. And that's something that we really try to take into account when we're doing forest management and forest restoration. So here's some of the things that we can kind of expect to see, you know, in a changing climate with the changing forests. So like we had already said, you know, there's going to be longer fire seasons, larger wildfires, that increase in tree mortality. A lot of this is going to be because, you know, it's a lot drier. There's going to be a lot less moisture because climate is changing. You know, there's going to be higher temperatures. And what we're going to see this is it's going to kind of impact on the lower elevations and then move its way upward. And also less tree regeneration after wildfire. If you think about it, if you're a seedling and you want to reestablish after fire, you need some really good conditions, right? You want something that's favorable to put on growth, to kind of get reestablished. So, you know, being sprouted in the middle of a drought year is going to be really hard. And so that's kind of what we're seeing. And with, you know, all of that climate changing with drought and moisture levels, that's just really putting them under a lot of stress. So this third one here is kind of, it really kind of speaks to the complexity that we're going to be looking at in the future. So we're going to be seeing changing in forest species. So I like to think of this. So think about it as evolution or elevationally. So some of the species, you know, in the upper montane, so let's say, you know, 6,000 feet to 8,000 feet, they're going to be chasing moisture. As the lower elevations keep getting drier and drier, those are going to start to transition to probably more drought tolerant species, right? So you're going to get grasses, shrubs, probably like ponderosa pine will do fairly well, but you're going to see other species kind of chase that moisture, and they're going to be going further and further up at like on slope as they're, you know, trying to kind of find their niche in that ecosystem. And so this is kind of one thing that is really, it's pretty fundamental to a lot of the planning and the management that managers are doing, because you want to set up an ecosystem to be able to have its best shot, right? You want to make it as adaptable, as resilient you can with climate change as well. So that's kind of a fundamental thing that's really being looked at. Another thing here that I think, it's kind of easy to forget as well, but, we're going to be seeing a lot more insect and disease outbreaks because typically you would get deep cold snaps, right, in these forested ecosystems in the winter. And that can really help knock back the spread of these pests, right? It kind of shuts them down, to think of it that way. And if it's a harsh enough winter, they won't be able to survive. So that kind of, takes chunks out of that population. But without, with warming temperatures and not really seeing those colder snaps, they're going to be able to kind of spread more rapidly. So that's something that we're definitely seeing. And, as we see now, there's going to be more impacts in that urban wildland or wildland urban interface. And just kind of looking at a lot of the fires that we've seen recently, there really needs to be kind of a redefinition of wildland urban interface, especially with what we kind of saw with the Marshall Fire and a lot of just the way grasslands behave. That's something that as a society, we're definitely going to have to approach. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom, right? Like I want you to know, like, there are a lot of really great people working on this too. And having a community that is knowledgeable about these things, that can educate your neighbors is really important. And so this is like, these are some things that we can definitely do. And so kind of the first one here, right? So we can target treatments in priority areas. And so this will go into the next slide where we're talking a little bit more about wildfire mitigation, but we can work with communities, find things that are values, that are our priorities, very important infrastructure, and target treatments there to reduce fuel levels and try to, kind of combat some of that higher severity wildfire behavior. Another thing we can do is we can change the way we suppress fires. These are actually some fires that I was on in Oklahoma where they started some of these as prescribed burning, but in this one on the right here, this was just a random start, but they let this fire burn. And you can see here, like, this is a great severity for this ecosystem. This is a longleaf pine ecosystem that is pretty similar to lodgepole pine or ponderosa pine, actually, where you needed some of that mixed severity fire. So this fire is behaving exactly how it should. And they let this burn for like thousands of acres because it was doing what it was. It was kind of that ecological recycling process. And this is something that we saw a lot in the Cameron Peak fire as well. In certain areas where it was burning, like what you would see, in some of these lodgepole stands, it was replacing. And that's something you see in lodgepole as a stand replacing fire. They were able to kind of let that fire behave as it would. Obviously still had resources and values that were protected, but working a little bit more with that. This third point is really important, and it's great with some of the work that Maya, Aaron, and Julian have been doing in Gold Hill, but plan residential developments to be more fire adapted. And that fire adapted is really key. Unfortunately, I would love to say we could prevent fires, but we can't. The West is an incredibly flammable environment. If you think everything out there can burn, and we're in a dry, arid environment, which, it's impossible to really fight that. So the best way that we can kind of move forward is try to adapt, work with communities to become, fire adapted and a little bit more resilient. And then I think these last two kind of tie into each other, but I really think it is important as a community member, and if you're a community leader, really become that source of knowledge, especially for your neighborhood and your neighbors. People, in a lot of the work that I've done in Coal Creek Canyon, I think something coming from a trusted neighbor carries a lot of weight. It's a lot more than just another government agency coming in, kind of telling everyone how to do stuff. But if it's from, your neighbor that you've been good friends with for 15 years, that holds a lot of weight. And that's something that can definitely change opinions, but also really mobilize and get momentum going at the neighborhood level. So this is kind of, and we're going to go in now to a little bit more of like the specifics, like what exactly is forest restoration? What is wildfire mitigation? But so kind of looking here, you're going to have different objectives, and there wouldn't be completely different, right? A lot of these overlap, and a lot of these can kind of work in tandem. But with wildfire mitigation, typically what you're going to be doing is that's going to be centered on fuel reduction. And that's going to be protecting your important infrastructure. And a lot of that is going to be kind of tied in with fire suppression, right? So if you're able to do mitigation work around your house, right, that might be an easier house for firefighters to then hold a fire. So that's going to tie into the way fires are suppressed in that area. And certain things that you can do around your house too are going to just, it makes it easier for wildfires fighters to do their job. But it also, this is kind of what we talk about with that fuel mitigation. And so if you look at this bottom graph here, and I apologize, it's a little blurry, but if you look on the left-hand side, right, we have fuels reduction. And this is going to be a little bit more targeted towards, you're trying to really attack that fire behavior, right? What it's doing on the landscape, how hot it's burning, what the volatility is. And on the right-hand side, this is going to be forest restoration, right? So this is where you're going to be looking to mimic typically what the disturbance events look like in the forest that is around your house. And I'll just say, like, this can look different. This looks different. It's a very complex thing. But if you're in, a lodgepole stand, that's going to look like a patch cut, right? It's going to look like a mass turnover, a big recycling event, because that's, how lodgepole kind of grow. If you're in an upper montane forest where there's ponderosa pine, that's going to look a lot different as well. You're going to be kind of bringing it back to that ponderosa savanna, creating openings, kind of giving that understory sunlight. Yeah, sorry. So kind of jumping into it, right? And I don't want to get too into the weeds on this, so I'll try to, make it short and sweet. But really, what we're talking about forest restoration is we're restoring forest and landscapes to historical tree densities and forest structures. And this is by reestablishing a source of disturbance. So disturbance, what exactly does that mean? That's really kind of any mechanical or natural ecological force that comes in and kind of takes out a bunch of trees. So think of it like you have a bunch of really old trees and they've kind of, they've reached their limit. They're kind of getting sick and old now. And eventually you want to return that ecosystem, right? Not all ecosystems are meant to just be completely stagnant for thousands of years. And so that's what we're really talking about with that disturbance. So that could be, fire, windstorms, disease and pest outbreaks. One thing I would say with that is typically that would be a little more spotty on the landscape. Like what we're seeing now is there's quite a lot of that. But so going into succession, right? And this is also on a spectrum too. So there's never really one forest stuck in one successional stage, right? This is constantly moving. This is on a linear scale. We're talking at a pretty large time scale. And so we usually have primary successors. So think about, you have some rocks. So think about, the Flatirons in Boulder, for example, right? Eventually those are going to be able to, and if you've climbed them before, you'll notice there's little pines growing out of like little pockets that you're mind blown, like how are they able to do that? Well, some lichen and moss were able to get into that rock. And what they're basically doing is they're breaking that rock down into usable soil. They basically start farming that rock, and then you're able to then get duff, you're able to get other nutrients, other dead plant material, and eventually start building soil. And so as you kind of get through here, right, these are your primary successors, so for right here with the high shrubs, I would like to think of that as aspen. So if you had a big fire come in, right, it's going to kind of knock everything down. But then you're going to see, this burst of aspen, right? These are the ones, the plants that have been biding and waiting their time in the seed layer, right? They're finally seeing some sunlight, so they're going to capitalize on that and try to grow as fast as they can. So then as they grow, right, they're going to get to, maybe 30, 40, 50 years. They eventually kind of hit their point as well, where they're kind of hitting their climax stage in the process. So they start to kind of die off, as well as, there's other trees now popping up and kind of competing with them for that sunlight. So now you have some pines moving. And eventually, as these pines get older and older, you get more of a like suppressed canopy, right? Nothing else can really grow under here because these are kind of hogging everything for everything else. And so think of that as, when you see some really big trees and there's really like not much sunlight, that was what we would call like a mature climax successional stage. And then eventually, when it's time to kind of recycle back in these trees, something's going to come in and take these trees out. And I think lodgepole is a really good example of this. So if you think of these as lodgepole, eventually, they have their cones ready that need to be opened with heat. They're all stuck together. Life's been kind of crappy because they're shoulder to shoulder with everyone else. You have a big fire come in, and then all of a sudden, pretty soon then their next cohort, their kids, their seedlings are going to be able to kind of take that next stage and grow up and kind of grow through their adolescence. So kind of what is giving us the idea that this is something that our forests need, right? And this is a really cool field, and and we're still learning a lot about this, but there's some really good evidence that we've found. And I like to think of a lot of this as forensics, right? Definitely reach out to Rocky Mountain Tree Ring Research. Peter Brown does some great work with a lot of these, and these are actually, this is from his website. But so some of the things we look at, historical photos, legacy trees, old growth, these are those mother trees. But within those, they have basically a catalog of hundreds of years, right? The tree ring research that you can do from this and from increment boring is pretty incredible. And they give us these forensic clues. And some of those are fire scars, and you can also see remnant trees on the landscape. But to mention fire scars, so if you look at this tree here, this was a ponderosa pine that was taken from kind of the upper montane mixed conifer area. And you can see, some mixed fire severities, but you can see it was born in 1623, right? So well before the United States was a country. And you can see each year here that is outlined, that's a fire, that was a disturbance event, right? And you can see, you can get a good idea of what the spacing was. So like from here to here, that was over 63 years. So there was a really big break there. That was probably then, this was a more mixed severity, a little more than just like a low severity fuel fire. But after each one of these things, which you can read, and it's kind of hard to tell on the presentation board, but you can read these growth rates. A tree's stump shot can really tell you a lot about its life. Each one of these are scars, as like, humans carry scars on your body. Trees encapsulate all of this and kind of capture that record. But also this tells us, how fast it was growing. Like right here, for example, you can tell this fire probably took out a lot because there's really good spacing between those growth rings, meaning they were really good seasons. Further to the left, you can see just how tight a lot of that got. So you can see exactly there as well. 1911 was the last fire disturbance. And then all the way to 1996, when this tree was cut down, there was no fire, and that's kind of right around that time frame we were talking about, that exclusion. But another thing here is to keep in mind, what we're really looking at is that misalignment of forest structure with topography, aspect, and elevation. And we're actually going to go through some of that in this next slide. Oh, sorry, after this slide, but this is some of the historical photos. So you can see on the left here, this is Cheeseman Reservoir. And if you just look up, you can see kind of, it's black and white, so it's obviously not in like HD, but you can see there's patches on the landscape, right? It just looks a lot less dense on that left-hand side compared to that right-hand side. And then again here, this is something like if you were walking around, this would give you a definite heads up, like that fire was around here. We actually did some inventorying at Arapahoe Ranch, and we found a ponderosa that was, it was too big to get it all the way with our increment borer. So that means it was probably at least over 300 years old. And on that big ponderosa, you got a nice fire scar that looked very similar to this. And that's kind of like a dead clue that fire was a part of this landscape, right? And as you can see, like once you get into those trees, you can see like just how much of a role it played. Awesome. So this is kind of what I was talking about with that moisture, with that aspect and topography. So forest restoration is not a one size fits all approach, right? It's not just like you take out your rubber stamp and just do that across the landscape. It really varies exactly on the site. A lot of this is very site specific, and that's because moisture is very important in this landscape. And that really ties into aspect, and that's, north versus south facing slopes and topography. So if you look here on the right, this is a moisture gradient chart with elevation, and this is from the Forest Service and Boulder, a bunch of the NRCS offices in Colorado. You can see like these are the species, right? It doesn't just follow linearly with aspect and elevation, right? You can get a good idea for like how complex these trees are living, right? It's spanning multiple thousands of feet in elevation, different slopes, but this kind of gives you an idea of just how complex that's going to be. A slope at maybe 10,000 feet with a very, very southern facing aspect is going to be a lot drier of a site than a northern slope, right? So you're going to see a lot of ponderosa pine there. Whereas if you go on the other side of that peak, at that ridge, in that northern kind of gully, you're going to get a lot of Douglas fir, a lot more shade tolerant. There's more moisture. It's going to be a denser canopy. And that also really kind of plays into fire behavior as well as like what you would see on the landscape. Next slide. And so again, you know, the thing I really want to preach here is there's just a lot of complexity. And this is really, you know, this varies on forest composition. So like we were saying, you know, an upper montane forest with ponderosa and maybe some mixed conifer is going to be different than, you know, mixed conifer or strictly a lodgepole stand. The treatment you would do with that would be different because the way fire would react and disturbance events would react in that are going to be different. You know, lodgepole live really close together. They have serotinous cones, and those are things that we can really kind of take as clues as well of what it is like to kind of restart that next cycle in that forest. But also kind of going into that, so we had the forest regimes and severity, but also, you know, community values are a really important thing in this as well as those priority areas and infrastructure. And this is something that we've really touched on a lot already, but it really is important in what you're going to see on that landscape. And then that last one, I just want to say is that's going to be a really important one too, kind of moving forward into the future. So yeah, just to kind of sum it up, I just really want to stress that I like to think of this as it's an investment in our lands, right? Whether it's public or private. I mean, we're talking too, like on a watershed level, forest health can really impact a lot of things. And we're in Colorado where we have headwaters. You know, a lot of states or a lot of rivers aren't as fortunate, or a lot of states aren't as fortunate as us that we have rivers starting in Colorado. And, you know, by doing this, you know, we can help to try to, you know, mitigate high severity fires in priority areas, but also kind of increase the resiliency in those areas. And, you know, by doing a lot of this work too, we can help prepare a landscape for accepting wildfire, which I think is something that's really important. You know, it would be great to do a lot of prescribed burning right now, but currently with the conditions our forests are, you know, that's a huge risk. But kind of working in tandem with fire now in the future can really help us. And, you know, it's really about increasing that resiliency as communities and helping adapt those ecosystems. And one thing I really want to stress too is, you know, this isn't just for, you know, our landscape and our built infrastructure, right? This has a lot of implication for wildlife and just general forest health. One thing that we've been doing in our Gold Hill project is we've been doing a lot of bird monitoring. And as a part of that, you know, we've been reading a lot of research. And, you know, it is a field that's, you know, we're learning even more. You know, I wouldn't say we have everything figured out, but in a lot of the research that we've seen, you know, there's pretty good context and pretty good data saying that a lot of having these treatments and these, you know, prescribed fires on the landscape creates this mosaic that really benefits a lot of wildlife, right? Not every bird is going to want the same type of habitat. Not all birds eat the same type of food. And so by creating those different habitats, you're creating different food chains. Like you're creating different ecosystems, really. And that's a very complex thing, right? So just keep that in your mind as well. Like this isn't just as selfishly as, you know, humans, we want to try to protect everything we can and simplify everything we can, but nature just doesn't, it doesn't have to play by our rules, and it's just not going to, you know? And then, yeah, I just want to stress kind of that last point, especially because we are the Boulder Watershed Collective, but, you know, it's going to be really important to protect our water infrastructure and our water resources. I mean, we can try to keep it out of our mind, but water is going to be very important in the West. And this is one way that we can really invest a lot of, you know, resiliency into those systems and really try to protect them.
All right, well, let's tune in with our Zoomies and see if some questions have popped up there. I've got a low battery. Hi, everybody on Zoom. Does anybody in the room have some questions while I pull this up? Anybody on the webinar still, if you have any questions or comments to share with our presenters, please do so. And did the moving closer help everybody that was having trouble hearing in the beginning? I got some yeses earlier, so I'm hoping that all worked out.
Do you work focused on residential properties mostly, or you're talking about?
So we kind of span, Yeah, we like, so our treatment in Gold Hill, that's around 100 acres, you know, larger level, but also, you know, working with communities too, because that's something we've heard, you know, it's tough. And like home hardening, I mean, you can say it a lot, but you know, that's a lot of investment too. So working with communities there, but as well as, yeah, that lower kind of home defensible space, talking to folks there as well.
We definitely work on. But we definitely work on building projects, forest projects that are primarily on private land, but then we coordinate with the public landowners so that we can align these things. But it seems like the gap is more.
You guys can be the little Q&A panel.
Awesome.
Can you see us okay?
Yep.
We will repeat the question too.
There we go. That might be helpful. All right. Any other questions from online? I don't think it's a question as much as just a statement. And I'd like be interested in hearing other folks' thoughts. But I really, you know, whenever I think about the climate crisis, whether it's about fire mitigation or disease and pests or migratory bird patterns changing due to all the different variables, is often I think we treat it as an enemy that we have to attack and that we have to stop, and that one day will just go away, instead of kind of reframing it as a reality we have to face, whether we like it or not. It's kind of a tough part about life, but the adaptation and the resiliency, and I love how you guys spun that into your presentation, and even from a scientific perspective and from an adaptation perspective, both socially as well as in the science. And I just think that is something that I would like to see in a lot more conversations and in a lot more mindsets, instead of just like the black and white, like we have to stop it, it's an enemy. It's more like, this is what's happening to our planet and we're on it, you know?
Yeah.
So
I think a cool part of the MEMV project was that Julian was really talking about it a lot as living with fire. And even just using that terminology kind of forces you to change your mindset. Instead of, I mean, we do talk about wildfire mitigation all the time, but when you talk about living with fire, it just like really changes your perception about how you approach the issues.
totally.
I think it's challenging because when you have things like Marshall Fire in this field being like, oh, there's positive fire, you know, not all fire is equal. You don't want to forget the human compassion component, empathy part of it either. And so it's like trying to find a new way to talk about it. And I know Sarah McCaffrey's work, she does some amazing work where she's looked at past funding, and it's all kind of gone towards fire suppression and how do we like play defense. But then she's like, you know, there's so many more opportunities we're missing to play offense. Like, how do we think about this offensively with forest restoration in mind?
I think the return on investments is like 4 times as much if you spend on the front end than if you spend money fighting fires.
Well, that would be really interesting data to get out, you know, into the, just to get out into the bigger world to help shift that perspective, because I didn't know that. And I don't even know that I would have guessed it, although I know that if the forest is fire ready, if you will, for whatever sort of fire can typically range through it, then you're going to have more predictable fire behavior. And therefore, if you build appropriately, which is of course a huge if that usually doesn't happen, then you would be mitigating back end.
That's another thing. I think someone who's been working on wildfire for a long time, Jack Cohen. Jack Cohen, he always likes to stress the point that, you know, community wildfire destruction is mostly a home ignition zone issue, and we can do a lot with our forests, but you're not mostly the reasons why houses burn is because they're not addressing their home ignition zone, fuels within the 5, 10, 15 feet away from their house. And so it's such a huge part. And we focus a lot on land management because, how big the fire is like what gets people's attention. But really the small things you can do at your house and also the big things you can do on your house, it can get expensive and hard to do, but that's where a lot of investment could be really useful too.
Yeah, it brings up the whole social component because I have a friend who lost their house in the Marshall Fire. And when she and her husband were talking about, so are we going to rebuild? Are we going to move? Are we going to rebuild here, someplace else? She said, we're going to look at the houses that survived. And we're going to talk to those architects and we're going to look at those landscape designers. And it turns out in their neighborhood, many of these very isolated surviving homes were all built by the same architect. And they weren't built out of wood. It looked like wood, but it was concrete that had been shaped to look like wood. And the roofs were actually made of some kind of a glass material, right? So these homes were built to be more fireproof. And lo and behold, of course, there were fickle winds. That was a piece of what was going on. But it just drives home the point of the complexity of needing to combine our architecture, right, with our town planning, our zoning, our personal preferences for what our neighborhood landscaping looks like.
Yes.
Like at a certain point, how do you not drown in the complexity of it? If I could try to turn that into a question.
Yeah,
No,
and
I
we
think-
dealt with that in Gold Hill with the
Yeah.
historical prevalence of the buildings, the importance of the buildings, that you having to balance that with the need to prepare for fire.
No, you're good. I think, yeah, you just highlighted again the complexity of everything, that it really is. There's so many different levels of things that we need to think about. But I do think there's little pieces, like in addition to what you were saying, a lot of the firefighters who were on the Marshall Fire talked about wooden fences. And that, the grassland fire, which behaved kind of like grassland fires do, would then meet these wooden fences, which were just a fuse to the house. And so the firefighters spent a lot of time tearing down fences, and that was effective at saving some of those houses. And so, we miss that part. Like we sometimes build these good fire resistant homes, but then we also build wooden fences that go right to them. So I do think there are some smaller pieces that we can just change slowly, culturally, we have to take those little nibbles too.
And one way to look at it, like if you're going home and you're like, how do I even start? Like one thing that I've heard a lot in the wildfire mitigation industry is like start from the front door to the forest, right? That's kind of like your biggest investment is going to be like the home hardening, like roofs are really, really important because most houses are started by embers. And in the Marshall Fire, like that was a grass fire. You didn't really see, the grass wasn't really kicking up a lot of the embers. What were the houses that were on fire, the houses kind of replaced those crowning trees. But that's, and it's a costly thing too. I totally understand. It's not as easy as like, okay, cool, we're going to completely replace all of our siding and roofs. But if, like Maya was saying, if there are things that you can kind of chip away at, it really is important. And then, also get involved at that forest level as well, though, too. If there's things going on in your community.
Yeah. Oh, no, I just want to add to that, what Lynn's talking about too is the system and culture change, which takes so long. But I think there is a norming effect that we do see, that more wildfire mitigation begets more wildfire mitigation. Like there are opportunities and stories where people say, my neighbor did it, so then I started doing it because I saw that it was effective, or we shared a contractor, or I think people can inspire each other to do it. And I think what we're hoping is also to have more collective action where it happens at a higher neighborhood scale, where whole neighborhoods are seeing the same or at least similar changes, because a lot of these places were built in the same time period or need the same kind of fixes. And so I think it's a lot of different efforts, and there are definitely days where we're like, how do we do this? It's hard not to get defeated, but I think small incremental change, you can't underestimate that. And the idea of changing our perception around what a landscape looks like around our home too is important, like what you're saying. So
So many trees are planted that would never have existed on the prairie, and they, crown fires and sparks going everywhere with the 100-mile-per-hour winds. So it's all this, also this idea of, if you choose to live in the prairie, please plant like you live in the prairie.
yeah.
And then that's going to address water needs, so many things. So I guess to launch into a question, it seems like when you have an event like the Marshall Fire, which was a tragedy for so many, it's to try to turn it into something positive. It can be that tool that helps you say, let's get together with the community and start to have conversation about how to mitigate this, not only in this community, but in the neighboring communities that didn't happen to burn by chance or maybe somewhat by design. So do you see yourselves moving into that space and working with those neighborhoods, working with the governments who are doing the community planning, working with architects, or would that be some other organization's work? I mean, I know many organizations need to be involved, but I just wonder, who and how do we support them?
Great question.
Oh boy.
Well, yeah. I mean, Erin is so awesome in the social science research piece. So right after the Marshall Fire, she put out a very short, quick survey to a bunch of different networks, really trying to find out what the people who were not directly affected by the Marshall Fire were really interested. What were those topics that people wanted to be finding out more about to like advance us collectively? And home hardening and home building was one of those topics that people were interested. Also in there was public lands management and environmental toxins, potentially from an urban fire, water, soil, air quality, stuff like that. And so we have kind of heard that from the community where their interests are, and we are planning a series of webinars and learning events for people to try and carry this conversation forward so that we can adapt a little bit. And I know that that is happening with other organizations too. We have wildfire partners up here through Boulder County, up in the mountain areas, but they're thinking about how to adapt their program to the urban areas. And so I think there really is a lot of thought going into. I know that Louisville and Superior are thinking about their building codes and their zoning and stuff. So there's definitely a lot of thought going into that. Yeah, we'll see. We have to wait and see what happens with all of that, which is hard.
Yeah, it feels like such an opportunity.
Yeah.
It's like, even though it's such a tragedy, the silver lining can be for us to learn from it and then build back better, more sustainably, more fire smart, more resilient to everything that's going to be happening to our changing climate, especially down there on the Front Range. But then you also know all these systems that have been in play for so long. So I really think that power of community and what Erin was speaking about of like small changes, and even what Julian was talking about of like the community of like, if you can convince your neighbor, they can convince their cousin who can convince, and then that grows. But it's like almost like a ticking, like what's going to happen? Is that going to happen fast enough, or is another fire going to happen first? Or it's like the hourglass kind of.
And one thing we have been thinking about, and that Sarah McCaffrey's work touches on, is complementary values. So if someone is valuing energy efficiency, for instance, how do we link that? How do we as a team go, okay, what could also be wildfire resistant on a home that also could be saving energy costs?
Yeah,
because like there's like
exactly.
the sealing of, sealing your homes actually helps with the flow of air going in and out, and also prevents embers from coming in. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, like what you said, Lynn, like the landscaping piece. If we do more local native species that are already drought resistant.
Don't get me started on lawns.
And that saves you
right.
money in the long
Then
run
it's-
too.
then that
honestly,
actually
you know?
also helps with wildfire prevention. And so I think tapping into the eco consciousness that people have when they move here or cultivate while they're here is a really, I think, a cool next step to think about. Like how do we kill not, I don't. Kill
we
a
feed
million
two
birds.
birds
How do we
with
feed a
one
million
hand?
birds with one hand?
I
Yeah.
like to say feed two birds with one seed. That's like
Oh,
my
that's
good.
like remake on that.
Yeah,
Kill
we
a
don't want to
bird
kill
with a
birds.
stone.
Yeah.
No.
But yeah, just thinking about those complementary values instead of the conflicting values. So.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, like it's really easy to get kind of caught up in climate change, you know, like what we're facing. But as a human species, like humans are pretty remarkably resilient, you know, and there are a lot of people working on this. And if we can kind of cultivate that on like community levels, I don't think it's necessarily like a fight we're gonna lose, you know, as have the rules changed a little bit and are they kind of ever changing? Yes, but that's kind of a part of that adaptive management and just kind of that the resiliency that the humans and communities have.
Mhm.
It's part of our evolution as a species.
Exactly.
It
We wouldn't
really
have
is.
thumbs and be walking upright.
Yeah.
Like we weren't able to, you know, take some weird curveballs now and then.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, when this might be the biggest like global existential thing we are all facing, but you go back through eons and there's always something that every generation thought the
Mhm.
world was ending. And when it came push to shove, we figured it out. And what usually meant us figuring it out was us coming together and putting down our differences or putting down our human stuff for like the bigger picture. And I think every single day, no matter what your political views are or whatever else, people are starting to be like, it's just so obvious now. I mean, I'm totally biased because of my career field and everything, but like, it's just, you can just feel it in your community and in your conversations. And it's like, there, it's now or never. And we have to kind of hold on to that hope that humans are gonna like get our act together and then we're gonna like hold each other's hands, put our chins up and say, let's get to work. Because that's really what it's gonna take, is not just like all these conversations, but like digging our hands in the dirt again, you know, and putting our toes in the dirt again too, and having fun while we're doing it, I think is like, for not forgetting the joy that comes with being in relationship with the earth and with one another.
Unlocking your inner pyromaniacs.
Yeah,
Yeah, like-
yeah, embracing the beauty of what fire does, you know, and what, yeah.
I would rather like fight for an ecosystem that maybe has changed a little bit than rather just like give up and kind of live in like a dystopian earth, you know, like
Yeah.
it's easier to try to at least give it like a, you know, some effort into trying to counteract the problem and kind of work to adapt.
One thing that we're doing that's a really cool project is we are interviewing fire districts and some of the volunteers and the chiefs. And I pointed out to one of them, oh, cool, Jeff.
Yeah, they always do that. It's
Oh,
fun.
it's so cool. I was like, so it seems like topography is one kind of key challenge, and wildfire mitigation is really hard for fire districts. But I was like, but everything else you said is a human system. And he was like, yeah, you're right. I didn't even think about that. All the other things are human system challenges. And this one thing is actual ecological ecosystem challenge. And so I think it's us not getting in our own way.
Excuse me.
I think that's important. Yeah, but yeah, I just think that I wholeheartedly agree. It's how do we talk to people who don't agree with us? I think that is
Yeah.
so challenging.
And realizing that that person that has a different perspective or different experience, you probably have a lot more in common with them than some corporate executive or government official. And so if we can find common ground with someone who even seems so different than us, that's really how we're gonna move the ball forward, whether it's on fire mitigation and understanding and or sustainable practices and policy. Yeah, it's a big cookie, but like it's kind of exciting to try to figure out. It's like my friend always says it's a puzzle, not a problem, and I've really adopted that, especially when it comes to the climate crisis and all the feelings and all, especially here in the West with water resources being such a thing and fire becoming a growing issue. Yeah, and I think it's also the mindset of changing things from good to bad. There's so much more complexity and nuance to everything. Like fire isn't just bad, but it's also not just good. There's so much in between that we have to understand.
Yeah.
And then the cultural piece that's added.
Yeah, it's complex. And
It really is.
it's hard for humans, you know?
It
like,
is.
I do this all the time. Like it's so much easier to think of something that's just like a one-way lane, you know, rather than like 7 different interstates meeting at
Yeah.
one junction.
That's how
You
our
know,
brains
yeah,
evolve.
it's just like-
This is a chair, that's not a chair. It's like this
Yeah.
is that, like, so when it gets into the gray area, we have a hard time.
Totally.
All righty. Anyone else have any other questions, comments? Any of our online folks? I think some of them are still with us. All righty. Well,
Thanks so much, Michelle.
Yeah.
Thanks to
Thank
Wild
you.
Bear for putting on
Yeah.
this series.
yeah, thank you. You guys are so
Yeah.
brilliant. I always love hearing you guys talk about this.
A little applause.
And thank you, everyone who joined us on Zoom as well as in the room. We'll be doing more climate action in the future. Next month, we have a 2-week series on building climate resilience through art and emotional resilience. So we're talking a lot about building resilience in the forest and fire mitigation and fire resilient communities, but this is really going to get into fire resilient hearts to the climate crisis. So we have an art therapist coming in, Zoe. She's a local community member, so that will be great. We'll be doing more stuff with the Boulder Watershed Collective in the future. They have a lot of cool stuff coming up. Do you guys have anything around the corner you want to make sure folks know about?
If you want to get on our mailing list, we mail out events that what we have. You can just go to our website at boulderwatershedcollective.org and sign up there. But we will have this webinar series that I spoke about, so that'll be
Yeah.
soon.
Yeah, and this was recorded. It will be up on our YouTube channel, so look out for that. Otherwise, everyone enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and don't forget to do at least one kind thing for another person on the earth today. All right, thank you, everybody.